Salve, turma! Como é que vocês estão? Hoje eu tô aqui, rapidamente, só para fazer a introdução de um episódio especial do Calma Urgente. Hoje, que é segunda-feira de carnaval, impossível puxar Gregório Duvivier e Alessandra para gravar um episódio novo, e imagino que muitos de vocês também preferem não falar de certas distopias cotidianas, e é por isso que a gente preparou hoje um episódio especial que, na verdade, foi gravado no final de 2025, se não me engano, em outubro, novembro de 2025, que é um episódio que naquele ano foi exclusivo para os participantes do nosso Clube do Livro, e que esse ano virou o Clube de Cultura do Calma Urgente, que foi uma entrevista que a Alessandra fez com o autor do livro que a gente leu no ano passado, Andrew Solomon, que escreveu este livro, que nós tivemos o prazer de ler em grupo, Longe da Árvore, Pais, Filhos e a Busca da Identidade. A gente quis colocar esse episódio no ar porque a gente acha ele especialmente interessante, a gente acha que é uma conversa que vale a pena ser escutada para além do nosso clube, mas também é uma forma da gente mostrar para quem não faz parte dele quais tipos de conteúdo que a gente também traz no nosso clube de cultura. Então, esse ano a gente vai conversar com diretores, autores e autoras e pessoas que de alguma maneira fizeram ou sabem analisar muito bem alguns dos livros, filmes, séries que a gente vai ler e assistir junto ao longo desse ano. Para quem não conhece, o Andrew Solomon, ele é um jornalista e eu acho um dos mais interessantes dos Estados Unidos nos últimos, 20, 25 anos, que faz algo muito peculiar, que ele faz um tipo de jornalismo investigativo, um jornalismo de profundidade da subjetividade humana. Ele usa todos os recursos de uma apuração obsessiva, mas para ir atrás de sentimentos e de uma paisagem emocional do nosso tempo. Então ele ficou conhecido, acho que pelo grande público, através do seu primeiro grande livro, que foi O Demônio do Meio-Dia, que é um livro sobre depressão, é um livro meio fundamental para quem quer entender esse mal do século, e ele se coloca muito nesse livro porque ele sofre de depressão muito severa, como uma condição crônica dele, e acho que de alguma maneira esse livro o orientou muito a escrever o Longe da Árvore, que é uma investigação sobre muitos exemplos em categorias diferentes de filhos que saíram muito diferentes dos seus pais, que caíram longe da árvore. Então pode ser algum tipo de deficiência, pode ser alguma questão sensorial, pode ser superdotação, pode ser crime, pode ser, enfim, uma série de coisas. E cada capítulo trata disso. E acho que mais do que sobre parentalidade, o que ele está indo atrás é de que maneira que o ser humano é capaz de se reconectar com alguém tão próximo sem reconhecer um espelho de si mesmo. Então também é uma maneira muito grande de buscar a conexão e que se conecta com essa questão de depressão que ele sempre investigou e também está presente de algum jeito nesse mesmo livro. Mas a conversa que a Alessandra teve com o Andrew, uma conversa maravilhosa, também passa pelo livro que ele está escrevendo, pelo próximo livro dele, que tem a ver com um tema nada leve, mas um tema muito importante, que acho que é uma lente para a gente entender os nossos tempos hoje em dia, que é sobre suicídio, especificamente suicídio entre gente jovem. Então é uma maneira de entender as condições culturais, psíquicas do nosso tempo e essa falta de futuro que às vezes leva uma geração a ser mais propensa a cometer o ato mais grave, mas definitivo que uma pessoa pode cometer. Não soa um assunto leve para uma segunda-feira de carnaval, mas eu garanto que não é uma conversa pesada. É uma conversa cheia de busca por uma luz e de muita conexão, e é um cara que vocês vão poder ver extremamente sensível, que a Alessandra soube se conectar muitíssimo bem. Para quem vai assistir aqui no YouTube, tem a legenda, é uma conversa em inglês, naturalmente. E para quem está no podcast, você pode ou ir no YouTube, assistir com a legenda se você não fala inglês, ou no Spotify a gente também tem o vídeo. Então vocês podem assistir nessa plataforma com as respectivas legendas. Para encerrar mesmo, participem do nosso Clube de Cultura desse ano. Entrem em calmaurgente.com e você vai saber mais como participar e dos inúmeros benefícios que a gente oferece. Para além de conversas semanais sobre filmes, livros, séries e coisas que a gente vai ler e assistir junto, a gente tem as entrevistas, as participações especiais, tem uma comunidade que só quem faz parte pode estar junto em muitos grupos de WhatsApp, no Instagram é exclusivo para membros e membras, e a gente tem no site calmaurgente.com uma lista muito grande de editoras, livrarias, teatro, cinema, bar, restaurante, e a lista vai aumentar, que oferecem descontos e parcerias para quem tem a carteirinha do Clube de Cultura do Calma Urgente, porque sim, temos uma carteirinha, então você pode ser um membro, de carteirinha do Calma Urgente. Então, agora sim, sem mais delongas, Andrew Solomon com Alessandra Orofino. Bom carnaval, turma.
Andrew Solomon, welcome to Calma Urgente.
Bom dia. What a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for making the time for this conversation, Andrew. And I'm going to jump right in. In Far From the Tree, you explore this tension between vertical and horizontal identities. And I was wondering if you could explain to our audience what these identities mean and how you came up with this concept.
So the idea is that vertical identities are identities that are passed down generationally from parent to child. So there are your race, by and large, is a vertical identity. Your nationality tends to be. Your religion frequently is. All of these are things that parents have in common with their children. Some of those identities can be very difficult. There certainly is a lot of racism and prejudice in the world altogether and in the United States in a hideous way right at this moment. But you also get all of the reinforcement of having a family who support you in negotiating those difficulties, who say there's prejudice against, for example, black people, but these are the ways you stand up to it. This is what you do. This is how you establish a sense of pride. Then there are what I called horizontal identities. Horizontal because parents and children don't tend to have them in common. So, for example, most deaf children are born to hearing parents. Most children who are dwarfs are born to parents of ordinary height. Most children with autism have non-autistic parents. Most gay children have straight parents, and so on and so forth. And those are identities that you have to learn through your interaction with the peer group. You have to be able to pick them up really from other people because your parents don't understand them. And in effect, instead of having parents who teach you how to be yourself, you have to teach your parents how to accept the person you are. And so I've called those horizontal because there isn't that generational element in them.
Fantastic. And when you look back at the book now, the book came out a while ago, how do you see that framework evolving in this world where family structures, social expectations, and identity politics have all shifted so much? Do you see any meaningful changes, or do you believe that the gist of the thesis there remains the same?
Well, the question of identity politics has become so central to conversation all over the world at this point. I just had lunch with an editor from the New York Times who said to me, do you think that black children need to see black therapists? Do you think little boys need to see male therapists? What are the boundaries of identity? And I said, the idea that there were these very rigid, boxed identities, I think there's been a movement away from that. I think it became oppressive at a certain point. But the idea that people actually need to interact with other people who understand who they are and understand where they come from is enormously urgent. And that what there's been, certainly, as I say, in the United States, but I think in many other places in the world, is a breakdown of communication among people who are having different experiences of the world. And in a sense, instead of saying, wow, you see things differently? That's so fascinating. Explain to me how you see them so I can understand it. You have people saying, well, if you see things differently, you're wrong and you should go away and I don't want anything further to do with you. So I think in a sort of liberal world, there's been a loosening of this idea, which was to some degree formulated through liberalism. And in what I would overall call a conservative world, though liberal and conservative have become vague terms now, I think there's been a tightening of it. And part of what's been striking to me is the question of gratitude and randomness and, I was born in the United States, and I have a mind that was in any case adequate to write some books. And other people were born to enormous disadvantage and are struggling across the rubble of Gaza under truly dire circumstances. And I know that while I've worked quite hard, that I was in a position in which my working quite hard would be productive, and that many other people who worked quite hard weren't in a position in which that was the case. So at the moment, the most dramatic evidence that I think we see everywhere is this prejudice against immigrants, and the prejudice against immigrants, which also often plays out in complex generational ways, because immigrant parents who don't really understand the culture they're in have children who then become much more part of it and so on. That prejudice against immigrants is based in the notion that some people deserve to have useful citizenships and the privileges associated with them, and other people don't deserve that. And so while the question at one point was just to define, well, who's like this and who's like that, the question now more and more has become a really urgent moral question of what do you do with whatever advantages or privileges you have, and how do you find dignity, and how do you find a sense of self that actually has power in the world when you've been born to these disadvantages and are facing prejudice?
That is a fascinating subject. We did a show recently about, Nick Fuentes and the Groypers and this emergence of white nationalism and white supremacy in the United States, and how that is now informing far-right movements, not only in the US, but all over the world. We have our own version of Nick Fuentes and the Groypers and all of that here in Brazil, for instance. And it's very interesting because, of course, Brazil has a complicated but quite different history with race and racism. It's not the same as the US at all. And the cleavages and the differences are just different and context is specific, but they're borrowing a lot from that idea. And if I had to define this kind of new white supremacy speech in any way, you'll be around the claiming of a white identity as something that needs to be protected, something that is under attack from all these other identities that have articulated themselves politically, right? And it's such a scary but also interesting moment to see that emerging. And I don't know that we are up to the task of facing that, of articulating answers to that. And I have a hunch that some of your research for your book can give us some elements of that, not necessarily from a public policy perspective, but more importantly to me, from an intimacy, how do you deal with the other perspective? So I was wondering, all of that to say, based on your interviews and the extensive research that you did for Far From the Tree, how do you now make sense of the strength of these kind of white supremacist movements and how they claim identity and the kinds of identities that they claim and the kinds of identities that they then disregard or consider inferior?
Right. So in the first place, I just wanted to say that, you all, if you'll allow me to use that vague Southern American expression, but you all did manage to put Bolsonaro behind bars.
Yes!
We instead elected someone with many criminal convictions to run the country, not to display all my politics too quickly right at the beginning of the conversation. But I think altogether that a lot of the issue is exposure, and that there is a very striking error that is often made, that people who feel most under threat from those who are different are the people who have the least experience of people who are different. So I've often said that I think if every American were required to spend 6 weeks in another country before the age of 30, no matter what the country was and no matter what it was they were doing there, that half of the diplomatic problems caused by this country would evaporate. And I think likewise, I certainly didn't grow up in a racist household, but when I got to college and had lots of friends who came from different races and from different places, I think there were a lot of assumptions I had made that fell aside. And I've been struck it's a very miniature and autobiographical thing and it's recent, but I had a very beloved psychotherapist whom I had seen for many years. I had suffered from severe depression. He died during COVID. I then saw a number of other people who didn't work out very well. And I now have a therapist whom I really adore, but I am really the only Jew in New York I know who has a Palestinian therapist.
Oh my God, I love this.
He and I sometimes get into debates back and forth about, particular issues that we may see somewhat differently. But I certainly feel that the fact that we are talking to, and so does he, the fact that we're talking to each other about all of these things means that we aren't taking positions that are as uncharitable as the ones that are in fact dividing and destroying so much of the country in the US and indeed in Israel and Palestine and that area of the Middle East. And someone I know wrote a book called Whitopia. He's black and he's gay. He went through the demographic surveys of the United States, and he moved for 3 months each to the 4 whitest places in America. Okay. And he found when he got there were all of these rallies going on that were about, we have to protect ourselves from the immigrants. And he kept saying to people, there are no immigrants here. Who is it you're protecting yourself from? What do you think? Who are these people you're talking about? They were all actually, because he's quite charming, very nice to him. His book is quite ironic, and it has a lot of anger in it. And nonetheless, they were perfectly pleasant to him, but there still was this fear of the unknown. And the place where I really came to understand this is that essentially most gay or queer people in the United States were closeted. And then the AIDS epidemic came along, which is certainly not how anyone would have chosen for progress to take place. But during the AIDS epidemic, people stopped being closeted. And so people all over the country realized, oh, I know gay people, I guess. And the prejudice began to evaporate. And I just think the separations that sometimes have been brought about, even in the name of well-intended identity politics, have been incredibly dangerous. That it's by mixing and being together and knowing one another, it's hard to hate people whose stories you know. And I'm particularly struck on the national security front by the fact that there's all this talk about how we can't let in all those foreigners because if they come in and they study at our universities, they'll sort of... I spent a lot of time reporting from all over the world. I was in Afghanistan, I was in Libya, I was in Rwanda, I was in South Africa at the end of apartheid. I reported from Central Asia and China and late Soviet Russia. Time after time, I found that the people who had actually spent time in the United States or the UK, which are the two countries that I'm a national of, tended to have rather affectionate relationships with those countries. The people who had not been allowed to go to those countries were full of rage and hostility. So there's this notion that because some of the people who were involved in the 9/11 bombings were here on student visas, that means that letting students in is dangerous. And I think it's not only that it's not dangerous, I think excluding students is in fact precisely what is dangerous, and that this attempt all the time to push people away is the thing that ultimately undermines the safety and security. I mean, I'm most informed about this country, but really of the world.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that as well, like this kind of transfer of patriotism, and at least in the Brazilian community that emigrates to the U.S. is certainly very patriotic towards the U.S. So it's a very interesting shift in identity, I guess, and affiliation that happens there. I am tempted to ask you about your war stories from all of these places you've lived in, but I want to stay with Far From the Tree just a little bit more. And one of the most powerful arguments in the book is that, well, I'm probably, I don't want to, this is not exactly the way you say it, but the way that I interpret it is that there is this conflict often between acceptance and the search for a cure or a search for to address something that could also be seen as an illness or an issue. And I was just wondering about how this tension appears. Well, how did you first formulate that tension? How did you observe it? How did it show up then when you wrote the book? And then how does it appear in current political and cultural debates around disability, around neurodivergence, even like things like body positivity? I see that tension all the time now when I'm looking and I'm reading about the culture and I'm immersed in the culture. And I'm just really curious about your take on that.
Well, it emerged for me because I wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine 30 years ago now about deaf culture. And I hadn't really even known at that point that there was a deaf culture and that people who communicated in sign language had a world that was so much their own. But I found that deaf children who were born to deaf parents often grew up with a sense of great connection to this culture, which has many things to recommend it. And that deaf children who were born to hearing parents had parents who were desperate to make them hear because they thought that was the only way you could manage and be happy in the world. Now, I can hear, at least reasonably well, and I like being able to hear, and it's not that I wanted to go and join deaf culture, but I recognized some beauty in it. I'm gay. My parents were straight. My parents were not so pleased when they found out that I was gay. I mean, they weren't terrible about it, but they certainly weren't thrilled. Yeah. And I think they had the idea that the way you could be happy was to be a man who had a wife and had a family and had all of these other things and was part of the sort of normal mainstream society. They didn't send me for conversion therapy, but I was so distressed, I think partly because of them, but partly because of the attitudes that existed altogether in the 1970s, which was that homosexuality was an illness and so on. I went and sought out a form of conversion therapy because I thought I can fix this because I had always been good at pleasing everyone and fixing everything. And I thought, well, I'll fix this too, and then I'll be normal like everybody else. And then I realized that wasn't going to work and that I was making myself miserable. And it was a kind of gradual process of thinking, well, if I'm not going to cure this, then I should get to the point at which I don't feel so sad about it. And that was the journey toward acceptance, which I think I've accomplished. There are sort of occasional moments when I get flashes of thinking, oh, life would be easier otherwise. But I also feel there are enormous rewards that have come my way. So then once I got started on that, I began looking around at the experiences of all these people I know. So I have a transgender goddaughter. I have an autistic god. I happen to have ended up with a bunch of godchildren who turned out to be pertinent to a book I was already writing before any of them was diagnosed. And I just thought, in all of these cases, in the first place, you have to figure out whether or not you can cure something. But in the second place, is it desirable to cure it? And also, on a larger scale, you might say, well, I have a deaf child. I want to be able to communicate. I would like my child to have a cochlear implant so that my child can hear. And there's a validity to that line of argument. But if we were to lose deaf culture entirely and lose the theater that's been built around sign language and lose the whole idea of the way that the human brain develops differently if it expresses itself through physical gesture than if it expresses itself through sound, that would be, I think, a terrible and catastrophic loss. And so the question is, how do we get some kind of balance between saying what we can cure, what we want to cure in an individual instance, and what we want to cure on a larger scale? And what are the ways in which we learn that we must accept ourselves, our children, the people around us, and then possibly notice that we can not only accept them, but also celebrate them, and then just become accustomed to them. And I had one moment that was of great clarity. I was at an event at my son's school when he first started at the high school that he goes to. And one of the other parents who was there was someone I had known marginally many years ago. Her son and ours had been in preschool together. And my son had commented that her son was very popular with the girls. And so I saw her and I was just making conversation at this sort of parents' event of the kind at which making conversation is nearly impossible. And I said, oh, I gather your son is very popular with the girls. And his mother said, well, he does seem to have an awful lot of friends who are girls. She said, I can't figure out whether that's because he's kind of good looking and they're all really into him, or whether that's because he's gay and that's who he feels comfortable around. She said, so I guess the jury's out. We'll have to wait and see. And what was striking to me in that moment was I thought she didn't say, yeah, I'm really worried about it. But neither did she say, yes, I think my son is gay and I'm going to be behind him and we're going to do, and she didn't get into that sort of super festivity, I'm waving my pom-poms in the air kind of mode. It was just a sort of, I guess we'll see, I guess we don't know. And I feel like in terms of all kinds of difference, if we could get to the point of saying, that's kind of interesting, I wonder, instead of being at the point of feeling like we had to achieve acceptance or we had to insist on celebration or any of those things, if we could arrive at that point at which it's not that much of a big deal, that would actually be the success of the society.
That is a very interesting vision for success. And I am stricken by what you said around the difference between having a valid desire or inkling for having a child that you can communicate with more easily, for instance, as in the case of being a hearing parent to a deaf child, and then erasing deaf culture altogether, and how these two things are very different. And I'm wondering, with the advances that we've had since you wrote the book, again, in IVF and, genome mapping and so on and so forth, how that's changed. I'm going to give you just a little bit of context for that particular question. I was very stricken by an interview that I listened to. I think it was with Ross Stout at Interesting Times at the New York Times. And he interviews the CEO of this company called Orchid Health. And Orchid's tagline is "Have healthy babies." That's the tagline. And what they do is that they do genome embryo reports, essentially. So if you're considering IVF and you already have your embryos, before you implant those embryos into the mother's uterus, you can essentially map out that genome, and they claim to offer best-in-class, extremely comprehensive genome mapping and reporting, so that you can pick the embryo that has a better chance of being, quote unquote, healthy. Now, their definition of healthy, of course, includes certain things that I think most people would agree are highly desirable. So making sure that your baby can survive outside of the uterus, for instance. And I think for some people that have very complicated syndromes in their family, that is a real concern, that they would even have a baby that is viable. But it could also include things like your baby not being deaf. It could also conversely include things like your baby being deaf, which for some deaf people could be actually a desirable trait. So how do you make sense of that in a world where the possibility of having this kind of technology available to most couples is becoming increasingly high, right? Like, this was something that was a bit of a luxury a few years ago. I mean, the technology wasn't as accessible, the price point was different, and it's now approaching that moment when it could become mass, almost like a product for mass consumption. How does that change the conversation around cure? Because in that case, we're not even talking about cure, we're talking about precluding that person from existing, right? And what does that mean in your mind?
So one of the points that I think it's important to make is that when one makes that choice in a prenatal setting, it's not as though you think, I will have the child I was going to have, but my child won't be deaf. You're choosing not to have the child who would have been deaf, and instead to have the child who will be hearing. And I think you're welcome to make whatever choices you want to once those choices are available. I don't take a strong moral position about it, but it's not the same as curing someone's deafness. It's deciding this person with deafness is less desirable to me than this person who does not have deafness. I think that's a fine point that people often miss.
Absolutely.
What I found over and over again in talking to people, I mean, there are some things, children who suffer hideously from Tay-Sachs syndrome and die within a year of birth and die in complete physical agony. There are some things that seem to me, but these are only my own judgments, that it really does make sense to avoid. But when I look at my own children, I mean, I'm very glad that they seem in general to be healthy. My real question is, are they kind? Are they purposeful? Are they loving? Are they upstanding? Are there all kinds of other things? And the genetics of all of that are so unbelievably far away. And I have met deaf people who I thought were remarkable people, including two in particular who have become very, very close friends, whom I would not have met had I not been doing this work, probably. And I've met plenty of hearing people who've done all kinds of terrible things. And I remember talking to the mother of a child who had Down syndrome, and she said to me, who had not known prenatally, she said, all of my friends thought they had these wonderful children, and bit by bit they've discovered their flaws. She said, I was given what seemed to be tragic news the day my child was born, and every surprise since then has been a good one. And so I think people's perception of what will it be like to have a child with this difference and the reality of what is it like to live with this difference can often be very different things. And I felt quite good about the fact that I've had letters from people who read the book and who said, I read your book and I realized I don't have the strength to deal with all this. It sounds totally overwhelming. And I decided to terminate a pregnancy. And I've also had letters from people who've written to me and said, I read your book. I was thinking of terminating my pregnancy. Some of the stories you wrote really inspired me. I decided to keep the pregnancy and have the child I had. And I've met almost no one, except people whose children went through really extreme suffering, who once they actually have a child, wish they hadn't had that child. I mean, some people perhaps who have accidental pregnancies and so on, but people who want children, you grow attached to the child you have, even when the child you have is really very flawed in a whole variety of ways. And your child will be flawed. So perhaps your child will not be deaf, but if you go with this parental fantasy that you'll be a perfect parent and you'll have a perfect child, you are setting yourself up for complete misery.
Yeah, there is a Brazilian documentarist, Eduardo Coutinho, who said that the most hideous words in any language were perfection and purity. And I think I strongly agree with that. And we're seeing that in the politics of the world today. Andrew, I want to talk a little bit about your new project. And you've told me that your new project is focusing on the epidemic of teen suicide. And I was wondering what you could share with us about where you are with that book and why you chose to tackle this particularly hard subject. I mean, I don't know what comes after that. You've been just making it harder and harder. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I do have what I think is referred to as a counterphobic tendency, that when something is frightening to me, instead of running away from it, I run toward it, which is quite weird because when I was a child, I definitely ran away from anything that made me anxious. It was something that set in later on. One of my son's classmates at the age of 12 jumped off the roof of his building on Park Avenue in New York City and killed himself. When it happened, his parents expressed interest in having me try to write about their experience and the experience of their child. I had also, years earlier, lost, when he was in his 40s, lost one of my college roommates to suicide. And there were some very close friends of my parents who'd lost a child to suicide and become activists in the area. I've suffered from depression, and I knew that as someone who had suffered from depression, I was going to have children who were at a higher risk than others were. I think I began the investigation partly because I thought these stories are so painful that nobody wants to tell them. And it may well be that nobody wants to read them, in which case no one will read my book. But in any event, nobody wants to sort of engage with them. And yet there's more and more of this going on, and there's so little information available. In part, I thought it was important for parents who needed information in general not to feel so alone and so ashamed in the conversations that they were having. But I also, as I've worked on the book, have come to feel that there is a great temptation always to present very simple solutions to very complicated questions, and that suicide comes up all the time, and people keep saying, suicide has really gone up since cell phones came along. Suicide has really been caused by social media. Suicide, and I think, well, none of these things have helped. I mean, I'm not wildly pro cell phones all the time in front of someone all day long, and I don't actually use social media, but those are actually the vehicles through which a kind of breakdown of the system of civics and values that kept a society intact has been communicated. And while I don't know that we need to return to an old system of civics and values, it's not that I'm idealizing the 1950s or the 1870s or the 1710s or any other period. It's that I think we've stopped thinking about a lot of really urgent questions. So I've gone to a lot of suicide conferences where suicidologists, which is now an entire field, stand up and present their work. And they've arrived at all these insights. They're psychologists, they're psychiatrists, and they say, we figured this out, and we put together these data, and we've got this information, and it sounds so impressive. And they, I'm afraid, tend to sound quite self-congratulatory. And then at the end of the conference, I always want to say, that's really great. The rate is escalating rapidly. Perhaps it would be escalating even more rapidly without your research, but you don't seem to be solving this problem. And they say, well, we just need to, and I think, No, actually, I don't think psychiatry is the solution. I think it has a role to play, and I think the insights that have come out of it are very profound. But I don't think it explains what's actually happening to a hopeless younger generation. And I've said, it was the bottom of Pandora's box was hope, and it's hope that has disappeared. How you reintroduce hope to the world is a bigger project than I'm going to attempt to solve in this book. But recognizing what the manifestations of it are, what it looks like, and what its consequences are, is a way really of saying, where are we in the world, and what are the things to which we should be paying attention if we actually want humanity to continue in whatever meaningful and sometimes joyous ways it has.
Well, I want to come back to this theme of hope because I agree that it's central. But before I do, since we just spoke about Far from the Tree, I was curious about any connections that you make between your earlier work and this new project. Like, what continuities do you see? Do the same themes of difference, belonging, family dynamics help explain why some teenagers become more vulnerable than others? Like, what are your thoughts on that, on the continuities and the parallels between the two books?
Well, first, in terms of saying what the vulnerabilities are, there are certain things that are obvious vulnerabilities. But as I said, I started writing the book in hopes that it would give me information I could use to protect my children. And the research has made me think there actually is no information that will help me to protect my children. This is a vulnerability that's taking place on a vast scale. There are some things I can do, but I haven't come out of it thinking, I've got the solution, and, just do this and this, and it's all going to be okay. But in terms of continuities, I feel like my first book was about a group of Soviet artists and how their lives changed Glasnost. My second was a novel about my mother's illness and death from ovarian cancer when she was younger than I am now. My third was a book about depression. My fourth was the book Far from the Tree. And my fifth was the international reporting. And when I looked at them all, I realized, which I had not realized when I started on all of these rather diffuse-seeming topics, what really interests me is resilience. Why is it that some people, confronted with things that seem so difficult, are utterly destroyed by them? And other people, confronted by things that on the surface at least seem somewhat less difficult, that some people with great difficulty manage resilience, and others facing less difficult things are destroyed by them. And what are the things that give people the strength and the courage to find a way forward? And what are the ways that we find meaning in suffering and in painful experiences? And I think that's what's united all of it. And in a way, suicide represented the greatest challenge, because I met parents who said, having a deaf child changed me in such wonderful and profound ways. I have not met any parents who said, I'm so glad my daughter killed herself. People are not glad of that. They may grow from it. They may change from it. They may become better people, but they aren't glad of it. And yet, nonetheless, it forces people to think about why it is that they have chosen to stay alive. And while each individual case of suicide is, I think, or almost every one of them is tragic, the reality that it exists means that you and I and whoever else watching this conversation right now, we all could have killed ourselves, and we haven't done so. We've chosen to be alive instead. And so in thinking about suicide, it's really a matter of thinking, without wanting to get sort of huge and sound as though I'm trying to rewrite the New Testament, but what is the meaning of life, and why is it that we keep going, and what are the things that drive us forward? And I think that's the question that's run through all of the work, from the Soviets who were experiencing such terrible persecution and oppression, right through to the suicides who are in a very different situation, but with some of the same issues.
Yeah. Fantastic. I wonder about that question about the meaning of life. And again, we don't need to rewrite the New Testament, but you said before that you didn't find any answers that could, potentially save your own children. And I like that. Not that I don't want your children to be healthy and live wonderful lives, but I like the fact that this is not a manual for anxious parents, right? Like, this is not about you saving your own progeny. And because this kind of survivalist mentality, I think, is very much at the root of so much of societal illnesses that we see today. So I'm wondering about the collective dimension of the meaning of life. And maybe you can't find an answer for your children in particular, but could we find answers that apply to children in general, right? Like, how do we make meaning together? And is there anything about that has come out from your research that could point us at least in the right direction?
So I would say a few things. The first is that as a society overall, we've come to a point at which people believe that anything that can be expressed in math is true. If there's a chart, if there are numbers, if you can say 37% of people all of that seems to be true. And narrative seems to be a kind of, cute luxury of well-to-do people who need some entertainment. And the reality is that there's a great deal of human wisdom that cannot be expressed in numbers. There's a reason why the Bible and Shakespeare and that none of it was written in charts and diagrams. It was written in stories. And I just this morning was making a presentation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it was about the idea that looking at art is actually not just because pretty things are pleasant. It's because if you really look at it, you gain insights into people and how they operate and how they think and how they see one another that are applicable to the whole rest of your life. So one of the huge things, I think, is to shift away from this idea that what here get called the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that those STEM subjects are somehow the important ones and that this other business is all sort of stuff and nonsense. I think that's been a gigantic issue. I think there's also this issue that because many of the children, including most of the ones who I've been writing about, who've died by suicide, have come from families in which they were very well loved, people are very leery of the word love. They don't like to use it, and they don't ever want to suggest that children kill themselves because they aren't loved, though some children clearly do. What it is not possible to assemble statistics about, because how could one ever know, are all of the people who might have killed themselves if they were not loved. And that is a group in which I include myself. I, as I mentioned, had this terrible depression. And at the time I was between relationships and I was in my 20s. And my father took me in and took extraordinary, extraordinary care of me through that terrible period and saw me through it. I don't know, maybe I would have survived anyway, but I feel like the sense that this love just never relented and never went away saved me, which is not to say it could save everyone and that the people who've died have died because they didn't have that. It's only to say that having that makes a difference. And so I think certainly I can't say if you love your children, they'll be fine. But I can say loving your children is a better idea than not loving your children for them and probably for you too. So that I think is crucial. And then beyond that, I think we need as a society to address the idea. I mean, I had to do a lecture recently, and they asked me to come up with the name of it sort of in 5 minutes, and I said, which rather surprised me. I hadn't thought of it in these terms. I said, youth suicide and incivility. And part of what I encounter all the time at the level of government, at the level of what people are doing at schools, at the level of how people interact when I'm getting on a train or something, there's a level of cruelty that's become par for the course and that people now accept as sort of, well, I mean, we're just all in it for ourselves and we all have to get ahead where we get ahead. And I've come to think that selfishness does not serve people's self-interest, and that people are very confused about that. And they think, well, I'm just going to go for what makes me happy. But often what makes people most happy is doing things for other people. It's not just that the helping is good for those who are helped, it's also good for those who are helping. And what you do for other people and how you do it and which other people, I mean, there are a million different ways to define it. But I think the narcissism that has become par for the course and this sort of unleashing of, I mean, there was one person who, this young woman, died by suicide after being bullied to death effectively by children at her school. Her parents held a funeral which was broadcast on Zoom for relatives who lived far away. And the children who had bullied the girl to death crashed the Zoom of the funeral and began taunting the young woman's family to the extent that they had to turn off the Zoom. And I knew that story, and it was horrifying to me. And then I went to interview the mother, and I actually watched the Zoom. And I thought, these are broken people who are doing this. It isn't that I necessarily thought, well, I just feel sorry for them, and I wasn't exactly forgiving. But I also thought, what what has gone on that we've come to this point at which that doesn't seem to be so surprising to people that these things happen. And I just think that we need to get back to a place. And it used to be that religion was often the bribe of sort of, if you're a nice person, you'll go to heaven, and if you're a mean person, you'll go to hell. And so it was almost a capitalist arrangement even then. But this idea that actually be kind to people, not just because you're noble-minded and have the luxury of being able to be kind to people, because then they might be kind to you and you might just all be happier. It's got lost as a narrative, and there are many, many ways that we could recapture it, and we're not really pursuing any of them at this point.
Oh, there's so much to debunk there and to talk more about there. First, I really identify with the first part of what you said around the STEM subjects and the importance of storytelling, and how certain things that we know intuitively or from empirical research or from talking to people, interviewing people like you do, we know that they probably make a difference, probably a big one, but they're still not quantifiable. And because they're not quantifiable, we then, in this paradigm where the only things that matter are the ones that are quantifiable, we then ignore them and we don't address them when we think about policy, when we think about social norms. And love is one of those things, right? It is very hard to quantify. Who can tell if a child who died by suicide was loved or wasn't loved, or how much love they had in their lives? It is almost impossible to make sense of, but that doesn't mean that love isn't a fundamental question there, and a fundamental tool not to avoid all kinds of suicide, because as you said, this is not going to work for everyone. And these are complex issues. And I'm sure that many children who died by suicide were very much loved. But again, there is an immeasurable role in saving so many children or so many people of all ages that we could assign to love. And we don't, because it's not quantifiable. And I think we are all the poorer for it, both as individuals and as a society, when we only assign meaning and importance and value to the things that fit very neatly into spreadsheets. And in fact, it's one of the things that I worry the most about with the advent of AI and these handing over of so many important decisions to systems that by their very nature can only work with data, with things that have become data, even when it's language, but it's language transformed into data. It's always about probability, right? Like ChatGPT will not tell you anything necessarily meaningful, but it will tell you which word most probably follows the previous word, and so on and so forth. And that's how it creates answers, right? And that world of probabilities has its usefulness, but it's not enough, right, to apprehend the world. So I am so intrigued by that and how that shows up. But then the second piece of what you were talking about around cruelty and narcissism, and I think it links so well together. I mean, you said jokingly that we shouldn't rewrite the New Testament, but at the end of the day, these were the foundational stories, the religious stories, the biblical stories that held us together because they were common stories. We had common characters and common values that we could all kind of relate to, and very different interpretations of those texts, but still some level of common storytelling. And I'm very curious about what replaces that. In my mind, for a while, maybe it was Hollywood, maybe it was like the bigger stories in film and TV that inhabit our consciousness and subconsciousness. Now, even that is becoming less available or less desirable. People are not consuming long format, even movies anymore. And our attention spans are so shortened that we're consuming these very rapid, like reels and TikTok videos. And again, not to blame it all on social media. Again, I'm less interested in the social dynamics of that. I'm more interested in what that does to storytelling. And what does it mean when stories themselves become kind of chopped, and you only access the stories that had the most likes and the most comments, which were probably the most outrageous ones, the ones that ignited the most kind of commentary, but not necessarily the ones that mean the most. So how do we yank ourselves out of that? And as a storyteller yourself, your whole life is about telling the stories of people who went through unimaginable things. Like, what is the role of storytelling that you see today, and what can we do as each of us now a producer of stories and a consumer of stories at a massive scale?
The Roman philosopher Lucretius, a leader of Epicureanism, said that the sublime entailed the exchange of easier for more difficult pleasures. And I think part of the problem is that the easy pleasures are now so accessible. They're all over the place, almost every kind of easy pleasure you can get within seconds. And people think, well, why would I bother with these more difficult? I mean, it just seems like a nuisance. And I had lunch yesterday with the person who's the head of the creative writing program at Princeton University. And she said to her students in her creative writing class at one of the top universities in this country, she said, how many of you actually can sit and read a book for half an hour without becoming distracted? And she said, they were very honest. She said, there were 30 people in the room and 4 of them raised their hands. She said, so I said to them, okay, I said, we'll discuss this next class. And she said, the next class when they came in, I said, you all have to give me your phones. And here's a really wonderful story. She said, and you have half an hour. And why don't you see what it's like just sitting and reading for half an hour when you have nothing else that can draw your attention? And she said they were quite surprised to discover that they really kind of liked doing it. It's as though because all of this sort of no attention span, no focus has taken over, we don't give anything else much of a try. And because a pop song that will catch your ear the second you hear it is a lot of fun, you don't bother with music that, by the 10th time you listen to it begins to feel like it has some kind of depth and meaning and so on and so forth. And I think it's really a matter of managing. I mean, unfortunately, it's a kind of sales job, but to say to people, look, I'm not just telling you to do this because I think it's somehow in the abstract, it's nutritious to sit and read, the great writers you're saying, if you do it, it will actually help you and you'll be happier as a result of doing it. I mean, I don't want to exactly say, my life has been a bower of bliss because I read Tolstoy. But on the other hand, I think that sense of sort of all of the knowledge of humanity that came out of the reading I did, the reading that my parents did to me, the sort of fact that I was lucky enough to grow up in a household where that was valued has made a difference. And there are lots of things you can learn from watching a film or from reading, something short. And so, but there are other things that take time and they take space. And so in the same way that I think a Zoom conversation, lots of information can be exchanged, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this one. But I won't be able to give you a hug when we finish.
Yes.
And we won't have a quick drink together and talk about sort of what it's really been like for you to be a mother and what it's really been like. There's a lot of stuff that just doesn't happen in those contexts that's very, very precious. And I think its value has been sort of marginalized and has been sort of lost. And that the value of these real intimacies and the intensity of real intimacy is something that's been undermined. And, I mean, we talked about hope, but the other great problem of human beings is loneliness. And a lot of the sort of these methods of inattention are methods that strengthen and enforce loneliness. And again, I think what we have to do is not say to people, you mustn't do this because it's making you lonely, and you must do this other thing. I mean, preaching at people is never very successful in these instances. It's a matter of demonstrating to people and leading them into the realization of the joy that can be there, and also of stopping being afraid of the emotional and sentimental life. I mean, I've noticed that in the scientific papers, of which I've now read 77,000, that relate to depression and suicide, because you can sort of say, I love the necklace you're wearing, scientists feel the word love is too vague. So you read all of these endless articles that are about things like sort of profound maternal attachment. Now, I don't know whether your mother wrote you birthday cards, but when my mother wrote me birthday cards, she did not sign them with profound maternal attachment.
No.
She signed them, I love you, Mom. And so I think there's this attempt to sort of become scientific about things and not to acknowledge, I mean, I don't know anything, in fact, at all about your mother, and maybe she would, but whatever it was, people love one another in different ways. It means different things to different people. That's precisely what's so strong about it, is that it isn't a formula. It isn't like, oh, I should learn to be loving. Okay, what are the 5 things you do to be it has to rise up in you. And as soon as you try to turn it into spreadsheets, as you said, you've killed that. And that's the beauty of it. And part of what defines love also is, for human beings as we exist anyway, is mortality. The novelist Jhumpa Lahiri was once asked, do you think a computer could ever write your novels? And she said, a computer can write my novels if it understands that it will one day die. And so I feel like in looking at these difficult questions like suicide, really it's a matter of saying, look, we're all mortal. And so part of what love consists of is clinging to one another with the awareness that we could lose one another at any time. And so the things that are most difficult and the things that are most rewarding are so intimately entangled that you can't have one without the other. And a lot of the people who are young people who are killing themselves not because of the unhappiness that they have because of their cell phones. They're killing themselves because they don't have either that real unhappiness or the real joy that should be its counterpart.
So I want to go back to the question of hope, because I said I would. And we often talk here on the show about the perils of, say, late stage capitalism, and how somehow it feels like so many of the world's biggest problems are unsolvable. And we ourselves have a hard time articulating a vision that could give anyone who's young today hope for the future. And when you and I indeed did have a drink together and dinner together, and did hug each other, we talked a little bit about that as well. And I'm curious about that aspect of it. How does that broader understanding of the world's issues and our role in solving them, and even the possibility of solving them, and hope for a better world, for a better life, not just for oneself, but for others, how does that play out and show up in your research around suicide specifically?
Well, I think one of the things that people often yearn for is a feeling of control and a feeling of efficacy. And I talk to people who are a generation older than I, and who say, during the Vietnam War, we really believed that if we all marched on Washington together, we could eventually get them to end this war and it would change. And actually, they did march, and the war did get ended, and things did change. I mean, I'm not going to say that all went smoothly and beautifully, but there was a sense of personal power and agency. I was talking a while ago to Anna Wintour, who's the editor of Vogue, and I was saying, the problem of anorexia has been triggered to some degree by fashion magazines, and she said, and it's contentious and it's much more complicated, but I repeat it nonetheless. She said, people who have a sense that they have no control over anything else are left with control only over their own bodies. She said, for a long time they expressed it through anorexia. Now many of them express it through covering themselves with tattoos and piercings. She said some of them express it by being transgender. And I thought, yes, and some of them express it by killing themselves. That feeling of being utterly powerless is a terrible feeling. And it's enforced by the breakdown of social and educational mobility, which I think has occurred worldwide and is very acute, again, in the US. But it's also occasioned by the sense that things are run by these gigantic, bewildering corporations on which you can really have no effect at all. I was at a meeting at the UN recently at which the ambassadors of several countries were discussing the fact that the president of the United States was really not relevant because the decisions ultimately rested in the hands of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all of the other people who have become the sort of hyper-billionaires of our time. And I can't do anything that's going to change. I mean, I could write them a note, but it's not really going to change their positions and their policies. And so I think it's this feeling of not only hopelessness, but helplessness, which is a very acute form of hopelessness. And the sense that, my father was born into poverty, and he managed to get an education and managed to make a very nice life for all of us. And I feel like there was this sense of progress, and now there isn't. And then there are these gigantic problems like global warming. Is there actually going to be a planet for us to live on or for our grandchildren or our great or whoever they are, or our children to live on? What are we to do about that? What are we to do about the rising of the oceans? What are we to do about this incredible inequality? What are we to do about the fact that there are people who do need to flee their countries and that we're no longer letting them in and we're sending them off to die? And in the United States during this government shutdown, there was, as used as a political tool, were what are called SNAP benefits, which are the food benefits for the impoverished. And I thought, look, there are a lot of subjects on which I feel very strongly, women's right to choice, gay marriage, all kinds of things. But I know why other people feel otherwise. I would like to convince them of my point of view. But starving children, haven't we all agreed that the wealthiest country in the world should not be full of starving children? I thought that was something on which there could be no argument. And so the sense that actually what is obviously significant and meaningful seems to have no effect on the public discourse as it's unfolding, I think is immensely destructive, not only to those children, but to all of the people who are not themselves starving, but who are observing, I guess if you want to win the election and it means causing all these people to starve, so explicitly, not sort of indirectly, but so explicitly by withholding those benefits, I guess that's what you do to win it's an acceptance of that I think is so pernicious, and I think it disrupts people's ability to form connections to one another, and it disrupts people's ability of any kind of safety or security or stability or continuity. It feels like is the world ending? Not is the world ending in a rapture, but is the world just falling apart to the point at which it's going to become uninhabitable? I don't think it quite is, but I see why other people think that.
Yeah, well, maybe the best answer to the epidemic of suicide is the possibility of deeper revolutions in the sense of really changing things profoundly. And unless we can, and I'm not saying that's the only answer, that every suicide is because of that, but I feel it in my bones that a kind of despair, as you said, has a lot to do with this sense of efficacy and control and the possibility of having an impact. And one thing that you do control to some extent, at least, is your own body. So if you can aim that purpose towards something else, because it's become so impermeable, it's very easy to then, point it to yourself. I certainly feel that. I spent, as you know, Andrew, a long time in my own career trying to mobilize people, to get them to volunteer, to show up, to gather, to sign petitions, to pressure decision makers, to advocate for better lives for their community. And I saw this. I saw how the internet went from being this great promise of essentially lowering the barriers to entry into civic life, right? Like it was easier to do things by email, by online petitions, and et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was that, it's going to be so much easier for everyone to participate politically in our democracies. And then he went from that to this weird version of that, where your entire civic participation happens in the confines of these platforms that are indeed controlled by just a handful of billionaires. In that language, it's very hard to go beyond that. And then it just becomes noise. It doesn't actually have any effect into the political systems that they were supposed to affect in the first place. And I feel very, very strongly that if we don't get out of this, not only we're going to see more societal level unrest and instability and the emergence of these far-right movements that are deeply radicalized and based on hatred, but also we're going to pay a price at a more individual, intimate family level. And that, to an extent, is what suicide is to me, at least. So I am interested by the fact that you're finding that in your stories as well, and in interviewing these families and trying to get to the root causes of this.
And I should say that you're very kindly interviewing me in this case, but I have tremendous admiration for the work you've done in that area, and it's been profound and extraordinary and transformative. So
thank you.
I thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I guess my closing thought and question for you, Andrew, is around what gives you hope. So we talked about what is maybe precluding particularly young people from having hope. But after listening to so many families, to so many teenagers, to so many stories for all of your books, and you said, right, what really interested you and continues to interest you is resilience. But that means that in order to get to the root of resilience, you had to really immerse yourself in a lot of despair and just really terrible things, and understanding what makes someone come out of those experiences stronger. But what gives you hope in your day-to-day, and both at the kind of family, intimate level, but also at a broader level, hope that we can potentially maybe build societies where people feel they have a future worth staying for, worth living?
So my hope, which I have to say fluctuates, some days I have lots of it, some days I have somewhat less of it.
Yeah, it's totally fine to answer the question by saying nothing does. It's fine, by the way.
I've had this experience which has been very cheering to me and quite surprising. I not to go into sort of completely autobiographical mode, but I have a 16-year-old son who became what's called a Senate page. So I spend 90% of my time saying how much I loathe the American government and 10% of my time saying how proud I am that my son is participating in it. And there are 30 pages. There are 16 Republicans and 14 Democrats now because of the majority situation. And they all live together in a dorm in Washington, D.C., and they're all 16, which is, I think, really in many ways still quite young. A few years ago, it was all Harry Potter stories. And now there they are on the floor of the Senate. And they have a very, very rigorous schedule in which they get up at 5 a.m. They have full school between 6 and 10, and then they're on the floor at the Senate until 6 in the evening and sometimes until midnight if it's a long day at the Senate. And
Andrew,
it's very demanding.
Let me interrupt you just for 1 second, because this is such an American thing that I'm not sure our Brazilian audience will get it.
Yes, please.
I love this program, and I want to hear more, but can you just remind our audience, or explain to our audience what a page actually does and what it means to be a page? I get about the schedule, but what is it? What is that?
What a page actually does is quite banal, but what a page learns and discovers is enormous. They're on the floor of the Senate all day long. If one senator wants to send another a written note, then they carry it across to them. They open the doors. They escort senators back to their office and carry their briefcases. I mean, it's not exalted work, but they are all people. They had to go through quite a rigorous process to get into this program, and they're all people from all walks of life, from all over the country, from various parties, from various economic and racial groups, who are all working, and they're on the floor of the Senate all day. Most of the senators come in and out, so they end up knowing more about what's going on day to day in government than many of the senators do.
And for how long does it last? Is it like a semester? How long?
So September 1st to January 23rd. And on the day they arrive, they all have to turn in their cell phones. And which, as my husband said, they look like a line of unwilling organ donors outside the surgery suite. And then they don't get them back until January 23rd.
Oh my God, I love this. So they're without phones, like completely without phones for a few months. And that is an incredible experiment.
They deliberately, in each room, it's both boys and girls, but there are 4 boys in the boys' rooms, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, so they're all sort of mixed together. And before he went, my son had said, I really don't think I want to do this because everything is so partisan in America, and people are just going to fight the whole time, and everyone's going to hate everyone. And then they got there, and these 16-year-olds are all agreed that the partisanship that exists in the United States is destroying the country. And they've all made friends, and they all do things together. And George's closest friend is a Republican page who comes from a Midwestern state. And George said to me the other day, having not had any kind of connection to religion particularly, he said, but I feel like religion is actually affecting the way they think about politics. And I just decided I should really get to understand it. So I've been going to church with them to try to sort of see what they're doing. And there's an openness from both sides, from all of the people. He said there are 1 or 2 who take extreme positions. He said, we don't all agree about policy. He said, I've also discovered there are people with whom I absolutely agree about policy who I think are really not very nice people, and people with whom I radically disagree, whom I actually really like a lot. And he said, and all of us are trying to figure out ways to talk to one another. And I went and I sat in the visitors gallery at the Senate, which you can sort of get access to if you apply for it. And I watched the senators arguing with one another. And I saw these kids, many of whom I've now got to know because I've gone back and forth a lot and sat with them and had lunch and so on. And I thought, the adults in this room who somehow managed to run gigantic, successful campaigns are behaving like 12-year-olds. And the 16-year-olds in this room who went through this weird application process, but who are from all over the place, and I thought, are behaving like adults. And what gives me hope is the thought that all of these things we're saying people have lost track of, nobody knows, nobody understands. Maybe in the next generation they will. And I don't want to aggrandize my son, who of course can also drive me completely bananas and up the wall, but just to say that seeing him in this context and seeing all of these kids, seeing these 30 kids together, I've thought, there are people who have noticed that what's going on now isn't working. And I don't know that they've figured out what the solution is, but at least they've acknowledged that we need to find a solution. And so, you know, I mean, it's so boring. What gives you hope?
No,
Youth. Young people give me hope, but they do.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I agree. And I love this story for so many reasons. I mean, one of the most interesting discussions I've seen around democracy and the future of democracy and going beyond representation is around this kind of democracy by, how to say this in English? Oh my God. Sorteio, tirage au sort. How do you say that in English? Drawing, like random,
straws, yes.
Random assignment, like jury duty, right? Like randomly assigning people to make decisions instead of actually making them go through campaigns. And I wonder how much of your experience or your son's experience has been guided by the generational aspects. You're all 16-year-olds, et cetera. Or is if it isn't actually the fact that they didn't have to run multi-million-dollar campaigns and go through that filter to become decision makers, to be there, and the fact that their application process was completely different, if that isn't actually a healthier way. In other words, aren't we, through our electoral process, actually selecting the worst instead of selecting the best in us, and setting people also up for failure because during the process of, you know, rising up through the party ranks and running campaigns and courting donors and all of the things that you have to do to become a successful politician and striking deals, sometimes shady ones, and, you know, all of that, if we aren't, in fact, then also taking people who could have been excellent, but hardening them in positions that they had to take in order to get there, essentially making them also worse through the process. And maybe this page experiment not only tells us about 16-year-olds and what gives you hope in youth, but also it makes at least me wonder if there aren't better ways for us to select the people who govern us, who represent us, through other more creative means. I mean, we've been stuck in the same system for so long, and it's clearly not yielding very good results. So maybe we need to get more creative. I think George should just run the Senate. This is my
propose
thesis.
That to him. But I think you're right. I think, in the first place, I think the entanglement of money in politics has been an evil sort of across history, but has been particularly acute in recent decades. But beyond that, I think it's too many unrelated skill sets. The skill of understanding what policies will make for a better world, and the skill of getting elected to office, and the skill of raising enough money to have they're different skills. And I don't mind that the world requires many skills, and I'm certainly not an anti-capitalist, but I think the idea that you can't make use of important groups of skills unless you're willing to sort of play along with all of these other things limits the field and eliminates a lot of the people who could actually be doing real good in the world. And I think there are a lot of people of goodwill in the world, and I think they aren't able to exercise it very well. And that's a gigantic tragedy, to feel like there are all these good people. They want to do good. They're willing to work really hard at it. I mean, even as this Trump administration has unfolded, people have said to me, you know, I have a job, I have a family to support, but I'm sure I could spare 3 or 4 hours a week. What do you think I should do to try to fix things? And I feel like, I don't know. I mean, they seem to be such a mess. And I feel like there has to be somebody who can rally everyone and pull them together and say, throw yourselves in and we'll be able to do something. And there has to be an openness to that, or a readiness for it.
For that. Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, Andrew, I want to thank you so much for your time and your energy and all that you've done. You have inspired us here at Calma Urgente. You were, as I said, the second book that we read this semester in our book club. And it was so much fun to read your book with this incredible community of people, thousands of people really, who read it together, who talked about it together week after week. It's been really the honor of a lifetime to interview you and to get to know you. And I'm sure we'll be talking about your next book very soon. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I've been so honored to be part of it. And if anyone wants to reach me, I have a website at andrewsolomon.com. Feel free to write to me. And if you read in Portuguese, I'll figure out how to translate it.
I can help you.
Good.
Okay. Have a wonderful one, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And you. Bye-bye.
O Calma Urgente é uma produção da Peri Produções e do Estúdio Fluxo. Na apresentação, Alessandra Orofino, Gregório Duvivier e Bruno Torturra. Na produção, Carolina Foratini Igreja e Sabrina Macedo. Na pesquisa e roteiro, Luísa Miguez. Na captação de som, edição e mixagem, Vitor Bernardes. Ilustrações, Ana Brandão. Na sonoplastia, Felipe Crocco. Na edição de cortes, Júlia Leite. Nas redes sociais, Bruna Messina. Gestão de comunidade, Marcela Brandes. Na identidade visual, Pedro Inouye. E consultoria de comunicação, Luna Costa.